Hi, we're going to talk about some work done on a Princeton Reverb amplifier today. This is a vintage Fender Silverface amplifier. It's a beautiful amp. It's got great tone. It does now, and we improved the tone by changing out the capacitors, by putting in a new speaker, and by doing a bias adjustment in the reverb circuit. This is basically as the amplifier was received. You see an array of capacitors along this circuit board. A big part of what we're going to do in this project is change these out. Hey, the first thing I want to do is issue a word of warning to everyone that there are some lethal voltages in these tube amplifiers. There can be several hundred volts. That can kill you. So if you don't know what you're doing, don't try this at home. There are ways to study up and get some pointers on how to be safe when you're working on such circuits, but I don't necessarily plan on teaching you all the ins and outs. Just be very aware that even when an amplifier is unplugged, there can be lethal voltages on some of these components. Another point to make is this is a tube amp, and these days it's hard to find tubes sometimes. There's some Russian vendors. There are also some boutique tube distributors, so we can get some really nice tubes. A lot of times they cost more than they used to back in the day when that's all that was available was tubes, the old supply and demand. Hey, so here we have the amplifier chassis taken out of the box that it's in, and it's set up on the workbench, and we put it up on some spacers so the tubes can hang down and we have plenty of access into the chassis for the amplifier. We're going to go in and take a look at what's going on with this, figure out which capacitors need to change out, look for any cold solder joints, any imperfections, any work that's been done before that maybe wasn't the best quality or something of that nature, and make a few voltage measurements, see how it's performing. This is sort of the incoming initial characterization of how this amplifier is performing. So again, this is the original circuit board with all the original capacitors. These blue capacitors we're going to change out. We're going to put in brand new orange drop capacitors. You've probably heard the term orange drop. They're basically the state of the art for audio amplifiers. And what I'm going to do is time compress this, and you'll see that I've put in an orange drop here, and we're just going to march right down the board and replace all those old tubular capacitors with orange drops. And it's quite a few solder joints to do, and you always want to make sure that you're obviously getting them in the right location. We're going to also change out some of these electrolytics, and you'll see that as we go along. Capacitors actually age and they degrade over time. Certainly after a few decades they can be virtually useless, so we want to get those up to snuff. We also want to look at the big electrolytic capacitor that pokes through the chassis here, see how that's doing. Here are all the tubes. The tube complement sits in these sockets back through here, right on this row, and this has been recently retubed, so that's not going to be a strict focus of what we're doing. This is the old paper cone speaker that was in this Fender Reverb amp, and one of the best ways we can get an upgrade in the tonal quality of this amplifier is to replace this with a more modern speaker. This is a Jensen mod speaker. It reads upside down because of the way the wiring goes in this. These are really nice, efficient replacements that give us a good improvement in sound quality. And that's the original speaker's serial number. A lot of times for tracing these vintage amplifiers, this is pretty critical, the speaker code number and the transformers. This is the old original electrolytic capacitor that's been removed. You can see that it's had some tough service. These are not really straightforward to get out of the chassis. A lot of times a small torch is required to desolder the ground lugs. The ground lugs are located around the perimeter here, and they get bent down and mechanically hold the tube capacitor in place. They also provide a ground path for the electronics. One of the things we noticed with this amp when it came in is the reverb unit had some issues, and we made some voltage measurements. This is the reverb unit right here. There's a little transformer that drives it, and this is the tube that provides the gain into the driving this transformer. This bias resistor right here, which is called out as a 2200 ohm resistor, was something dramatically different from that. It was somewhere around 600 ohms or something. We were only getting 4.6 volts here, and we had to go all the way up to 3800 ohms to get about 7 volts for a bias point here. And then we got a really good performance. There's a lot to reverb circuit. So in this old Fender, this is a circuit that actually has the springs. This is actually, I've taken the reverb unit and pulled it out of the chassis, and you see the input and output here with some of the circuitry that we were able to dig up underneath. So this is as received right out of the box. This is a long tank reverb unit for this amplifier. This is pretty much an exact copy of what the factory would have put in the original unit, and it's really interesting. The sound that you get from reverb units is controlled by the springs and these voice coils for the excitation of the springs and the pickup. But it also has a lot to do with taste, and I think when individuals listen to the sound of a particular reverb unit, this is the original reverb unit here, there's a lot of individuality on what people really prefer. So even though we ordered a brand new reverb unit for this amplifier, the sound that was preferred by the owner of the amplifier was one that came from a short path reverb unit. Fortunately, we had something in hand that we were able to throw into this amp, and between modifying the bias on the reverb circuit and putting in the reverb unit that the owner preferred, we got the tone that he was looking for. This is a wide view of the chassis for this Fender Silverface. All the orange drop capacitors are in here now. We've got the new electrolytic capacitor in place. Got nice hot solder joints on the ground lugs surrounding. Good hot solder joints on the wiring. Try to keep all the original wiring. In this case, one of the wires was in such bad shape we went ahead and replaced it with some newer vintage Teflon insulated wire. And you get a pretty good picture now of all those tubular capacitors that have been changed out. The next thing we're going to do is change out some of these electrolytics. The electrolytics age and degrade pretty heavily also. Well, this is the completed project. The customer turned out to be very happy with what we did here. We've got the changed out speaker, that's the Jensen mod speaker. We've got all the orange drop capacitors up here in the chassis. We changed out a connection that was noisy. We've got a reverb in here that the customer prefers, and it was recently retubed, so we've got a pretty fresh complement of tubes. And this is a nice amp, gives great tone. It's actually one of the favorite amps I've ever played through. The goal with all of this is we're trying to please the person, the artist, the performer, give them the sound that they're looking for. So whatever comes out sounding the best is really the right solution.